Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in as we just have finished up our kind of capstone project for the, just look at our due dates here, for the short fiction part of our Intro to Lit class online here. So we spent a couple of units working on this final projects, both units 5 and 6. Again, 5 being kind of the key one that devoted really more time than we needed, I think, to just getting people connected with their group. So a pretty easy thing to do, not a lot of work really, but obviously really key to making then Unit 6 possible, where you've already connected with somebody and then you can work on a project. So I think they turned out really well. I just want to take a quick look here. Again, I was able to, because they were shared with me, I was able to grab them and embed them right in our course here, which is, really nice to have them just easily accessible. So most people did the Google Slide idea, which is pretty cool. Some really interesting comparisons here. And then we had a website that was built. Where are you, website? There you are, right? It's pretty interesting. Definitely take a look at that one if you haven't. So again, like I said, lots of different stories chosen, lots of different kind of ways in which the stories were connected. So I think it seemed to turn out really, really well. And then Unit 6 kind of wrapped up where we were finishing the projects, and then there was a discussion board, which was sort of set up as a prompt for people to look at some of the projects and just, respond a little bit, providing maybe some feedback, hopefully mostly positive, maybe identifying things that connections between stories you hadn't thought of before. And again, as with all discussion boards, looking for not just that part of it, the sort of top level part, but maybe a little bit more in the way of detail as well. Okay, so that really wraps up, like I said, the short fiction part of our course, and we transition now into Unit 7, into the poetry part of our course. So again, important to just see where those due dates are lining up, and we can take a quick look at Unit 7. So poetry is, here we are, an interesting genre from my perspective, because in many ways it seems kind of marginal. Maybe not like for a group like us, we're taking an Intro to Lit class, so we have that interest already. But like generally, kind of culturally speaking, poetry is sort of a marginal thing. Very few people write it or admit to writing it or actively work, to publish it. It doesn't get a lot of press, publicity. Very few people read it actively. Some people, again, do, right? But kind of generally speaking. So it seems marginal in that way, and yet in a lot of other ways, it's really central to our lives, and people encounter it almost every day. So I think lyrics is one of the obvious ways, and that's why our reading is from a poet, but also a musical artist. So it's sort of that crossover effect. I think there's some important differences to recognize between lyrics and poetry, just in terms of how they operate, like the contexts in which they exist. Again, lyrics in the context of music going on, so we have a different set of expectations. It has a different set of maybe goals. And even music that we encounter, it often exists in this larger visual context, whether it's music videos or just the persona of the performer, the band, whatever. So there's all of that goes along with it as well. So there's some important differences, but certainly lyrics are maybe a form of poetry, we could say. So that's an obvious way that we encounter poetry on a much more regular basis than maybe we realize. But I think there's another way, or another set of ways to think about poetry that maybe makes it less distant and less marginal. Clearly we could recognize how often in major life moments, whether they're happy or sad, like a birth, a marriage, a death, so those sort of big private moments, but also big public ceremonies as well, it's often poetry that we go to because it has that like intensity of language and that sort of intensity of emotion or feeling or whatever you want to call it. So again, this marginal thing that we often don't think about necessarily is actually where we turn for those big life or public moment events. And then the other way that I think we encounter poetry, even though we don't necessarily think about it that way, is in the form of advertising specifically, but really in the world of text around us. And that's what this kind of introductory unit for poetry is going to have us kind of thinking about. The way that poetry is, like it's explained here, sort of marginal in so many ways, and yet so central and so present for us in so many other ways. It's just that maybe we don't recognize it, or we don't take time to, or we just don't think about it in those terms. So that's what this unit is going to help us to do, I hope. So you'll notice that we're going to do, instead of like the discussion board format, we're going to use the Padlet tool again, so that sort of digital corkboard. So again, designed to be a mobile assignment, so you're out there in the world kind of looking for this or thinking about it. You're not just going to Google an image and post it in there, so that's not going to count for what we're doing. So we're just looking for poetry as it exists in the world. But again, poetry in that really broader sense than just having to find a book of poems and open it up. So that's clearly not what we want to find. We want to find that language that's out there in the world that either is, or you just think it is, poetic. Maybe it's an advertisement, for example. Maybe it's some other use of language. Again, not just opening a book of poetry and taking a picture of that. We already know that that's poetry. But we're trying to find it kind of out there in our everyday lives. And so that invites us to think about what is on the surface a pretty simple question, like poetry. We kind of know it when we see it versus a short story. But what, like, fundamentally is the difference between those genres? And I think the deeper we dig, the more sort of tricky it gets to divide those genres in a really clear way. So it's sort of useful to organize a course, but beyond that, what could we say that's definitively short fiction is this, poetry is this, right? How do we separate those? And like I said, it gets more challenging the more deeply we think about it. So we could say something like poetry, or a short story tells a story, obviously, and poetry, what would we say, doesn't? Because that's not totally true. Not all poems are narrative or tell a story, but certainly they could, and certainly many do. So that's not a really helpful distinction. And it may sound too simplistic, but in some ways, because we recognize a poem versus a short story when we would look at it, one of the useful differences is simply the way they exist on the page, or on kind of however you're encountering it. So there is such a thing as a prose poem, again, a sort of a cross-genre type thing. But poetry tends to exist on the page, where we have those line breaks or use of spacing between stanzas, line length, all that kind of stuff. So the fact that we can kind of see it and realize that it's a poem is actually more important than we might think. So the use of white space, right? The use of that blank area, it helps to, I think, highlight what poetry tends to be good at, and why it shows up in those really sort of profound life moments, is that it may be unlike short fiction, but again, we can't really make this distinction totally, but poetry depends on a sort of intensity of language. So that's why we could have a very short poem, like it exists on a single page, for example. So word count wise, it'd be way shorter than a short story, but it can still tell a story, still have characters. It can still evoke emotion or reaction from the reader. It can do all of that stuff. But because of the way it uses line breaks and the white space on the page, and because of the careful choice of words, it again depends on or uses that intensity of language in a way that other genres maybe don't all the time. And again, it's not a perfect distinction, but it's part of what makes poetry poetry. And that's not to say that short stories don't depend on intensity of language, but there tends to be a lot more space, like literally a lot more words at play in a short story, that give the author a lot more flexibility to not always have that sort of heightened intensity that most good poems do. Even long ones will maintain an intensity. And there might be a reason that we don't often encounter long poems, because it's just hard to maintain that intensity of language over a long span of time. So if you're looking for a way to think about poetry that's like different from short stories as we covered them before, maybe it's that intensity of language, maybe it's the way they exist on the page or how we encounter them, but just our gut sort of ability to say, this seems to be a poem, this seems to be a short story. There's actually like more to that that sort of points us in the right direction. So I think our gut is right in we know it when we see it, that kind of a thing. Okay, so the assignment itself then, again, meant to be mobile, so you're out in the world. I'm going to text out this Padlet address, so you'll have it on your phone if you've signed up for our little remind text messaging feature here. And again, the idea is to sort of keep your eyes out for what you think counts as poetry. Again, not just Googling something, not just opening a book of poems and finding a poem. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to find, right, poetry as we think it exists in the world. So look for, especially advertising, because think about it. What does advertising do? It tries to evoke an emotion, evoke a reaction, all of the things that we do as writers. And it often does that by using that intensity of language. So it's maybe no surprise that often poetry takes the form, or advertising takes the form of poetry. But you might be able to find it in other surprising places as well. All right. So I hope you have sort of fun doing this, because it's not just that sit at the computer and do the assignment kind of a thing. And it also gives us a nice doorway into a genre that a lot of people have, they're sort of dubious about, a little feel like they don't kind of get poetry all the time, or it's this distant thing. Again, it's like weirdly marginal, but really central for us. So it comes with, like I say here, all of that baggage. Okay, so as always, if you have any questions or concerns, be in touch with me, and look for this Padlet address to be texted out to you, so you'll have it right there on your phone, and you can hopefully capture some poetry as it exists out there in the world.